In June 1942, Japanese troops landed on American soil. Not a distant territory, not a contested colonial possession thousands of miles from the mainland. American soil, part of the sovereign territory of the United States, seized and occupied by an invading foreign army for over a year. American soldiers would eventually have to storm those same beaches to take it back, fighting through fog, sub-zero cold, and some of the worst weather conditions any army has ever fought in a battle that would produce a higher casualty rate proportionally than the invasion of Normandy. Almost nobody remembers this happened. The Aleutian Islands Campaign, fought across a wind-swept, fog-choked chain of volcanic islands stretching out from the Alaska towards Siberia, is one of the strangest and most overlooked chapters of the entire Pacific War. It's a story of a Japanese invasion force that seized barren rock in the middle of nowhere, an American public gripped by genuine fear of a mainland invasion that never actually came, and a battle so brutal that survivors compared it to some of the worst fighting anywhere in the Pacific, all fought over islands so remote, so miserable, and so strategically marginal that many historians still debate whether any of it needed to happen at all. This is the story of the only WWII land battle fought on incorporated United States territory and why it's been almost entirely erased from popular memory of the war. Part 1. The Aleutians Themselves, a World of Fog and Rock. Before getting into the fighting, it's worth understanding just what kind of place the Aleutian Islands actually are, because the geography itself is practically a character in this story. The Aleutian chain stretches for roughly 1,900 kilometers from the Alaska Peninsula out into the North Pacific, curving toward Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, a string of over 300 volcanic islands, most of them treeless, wind-scoured, and almost perpetually shrouded in dense fog created by the collision of the cold Bering Sea and the relatively warmer Pacific Current. Weather conditions in the Aleutians are, by nearly universal military consensus from anyone who fought there, some of the worst on Earth. Violent, sudden windstorms known as willy-waws, capable of flipping aircraft and destroying tents without warning. Near constant fog that grounded aircraft for days or weeks at a time. And a damp, bone-deep cold that soldiers on both sides found more debilitating than actual combat. In 1942, this remote, sparsely populated territory, home to a small population of indigenous Unangachs, Aleut people, along with a handful of American military garrisons, suddenly found itself thrust into the center of American strategic anxiety. And to understand why, you have to go back to the event that changed everything about how America saw the Pacific, Pearl Harbor. Part 2. The Fear of a Northern Invasion. After Pearl Harbor, American military planners and the American public alike were gripped by a genuine, widespread fear that Japan might attempt a mainland invasion of the United States. And the Aleutians, sitting like stepping stones between Japan and Alaska, played directly into that fear. West Coast defenses were hurriedly reinforced. Japanese Americans were forcibly interned based partly on unfounded suspicion tied to this invasion anxiety. And Alaska itself, long neglected as a strategic backwater, suddenly became a priority for military planners worried that it could serve as a stepping stone for a Japanese assault on the Pacific Northwest. Japan, for its part, had genuine, if more limited, strategic interests in the region as well. Japanese naval planners saw value in denying the Aleutians to the United States as a potential staging ground for American bombers that could threaten the Japanese home islands via a northern route, and in extending Japan's defensive perimeter to make any American counteroffensive in the Pacific more costly and complicated. a hope that seizing American territory, however remote and marginal, might provide a propaganda and morale boost, demonstrating Japan's reach even onto sovereign U.S. soil. But the operation that actually brought Japanese troops to the Aleutians in June 1942 wasn't really about the Aleutians at all. It was a diversion. Part 3. A sideshow to Midway. The Japanese assault on the Aleutians was conceived as part of the same broader operation that led to the Battle of Midway, arguably the single most decisive naval battle of the entire Pacific War. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan called for a diversionary strike against the Aleutians to draw American naval attention and forces northward, away from Midway, where Yamamoto intended to lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet's remaining carriers into a decisive war-winning battle. It's one of history's great strategic ironies that the diversion succeeded in landing troops on American soil, while the main operation it was meant to support turned into one of the catastrophic defeats in Japanese naval history. American codebreakers had already cracked significant portions of Japanese naval codes and knew Midway, not the Aleutians, was the primary target, meaning the diversion largely failed in its actual strategic purpose, even as its tactical component, the Aleutian landings themselves, went ahead essentially unopposed. On June 3rd and 4th, 1942, the same days the Battle of Midway was unfolding hundreds of miles to the south, Japanese carrier aircraft struck the American base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, causing damage but failing to achieve a decisive result. Then, in early June, Japanese forces landed unopposed on two of the westernmost Aleutian Islands, Attu and Kiska. These were the only two pieces of incorporated American territory to be occupied by a foreign military power during the entire Second World War. Part 4. Occupation. Life under Japanese rule on American soil. The islands Japan actually seized were, from a purely strategic standpoint, almost absurdly unimportant. Attu and Kiska were remote, barely populated, and offered little of practical military value beyond denial and symbolism. Kiska had a small U.S. Navy weather station garrison. Attu had an even smaller American presence, along with a village of around 40 Unanagak villagers. The human story of the occupation of Attu is genuinely tragic and remains one of the least told aspects of the entire campaign. The Unanagak villagers captured when Japan landed were transported to Japan itself and held as prisoners for the remainder of the war, in conditions that led to the deaths of roughly half the group before the war's end. A grim, largely forgotten episode of civilian suffering tied directly to a campaign most Americans have never heard of in the first place. Meanwhile, the broader Unanagak population across the rest of the Aleutians, fearing further Japanese advances, was controversially evacuated by the U.S. government itself to internment-like camps in Southeast Alaska, where conditions were often poor and where many also died, meaning Aleutian Islanders suffered serious hardship and loss of life on both the Japanese and American sides of this conflict. Japanese forces, meanwhile, set about fortifying Attu and Kiska, digging in extensive defensive positions, particularly on Kiska, anticipating that the United States would eventually attempt to retake the islands and preparing accordingly. Part 5. America's Slow Response. For much of 1942 and into early 1943, the American response to the Japanese occupation was limited mostly to a grinding, unglamorous air and naval campaign. long-range bombing raids against Japanese positions on Kiska and Attu, conducted in atrocious weather conditions that made flying itself often more dangerous than enemy fire, along with a naval blockade intended to strangle Japanese supply lines to the occupied islands. This slow campaign of attrition set the stage for one of the stranger naval engagements of the entire Pacific War, the Battle of the Komandorski Islands, fought in March 1943, when American naval forces intercepted a Japanese convoy attempting to resupply the Aleutian garrisons. It was one of the last purely gunnery-based naval battles of the war, fought without significant air or submarine involvement on either side, ending inconclusively but ultimately convincing Japanese Naval Command that continued surface resupply of the Aleutian garrisons was becoming too costly to sustain reliably, a strategic dead end that would leave the defenders of Attu increasingly isolated as 1943 wore on. By spring 1943, American planners decided it was time to retake the islands directly, beginning with the smaller but more heavily garrisoned position, Attu. Part 6. The Battle of Attu, fought in May 1943, would come to be known among the relatively few historians who study it closely by a telling nickname, the Forgotten Battle. It's a battle worth examining closely because by almost any measure, it was one of the most brutal fights of the entire Pacific War, and its obscurity relative to its actual severity is genuinely striking. American forces, primarily the 7th Infantry Division, a unit that had originally trained for desert warfare in California and was hastily redirected and re-equipped for Arctic conditions with startlingly little time to adjust, landed on Attu on May 11, 1943, expecting a relatively straightforward operation against a garrison numbering around 2,900 Japanese troops. What followed instead was nearly 3 weeks of brutal fighting across some of the most hostile terrain and weather conditions American troops encountered anywhere during the entire war. The Japanese garrison, understanding no reinforcement or evacuation was coming, dug into the island's steep, fog-shrouded mountains and fought a determined, costly defense, forcing American troops to fight uphill through freezing temperatures, deep snow, and near-constant fog that made coordination between units extraordinarily difficult, even by the standards of Pacific Island fighting. American forces suffered heavily not just from combat, but from the environment itself. Frostbite, trench foot, and exposure caused casualties that in some accounts rivaled or exceeded those inflicted by enemy fire, a grim testament to just how punishing the Aleutian environment was even without an enemy actively shooting at you. The battle reached its horrific climax on May 29, 1943, when the remaining Japanese garrison, understanding their position was hopeless and following the same code that would produce similar tragedies later in the Pacific War, launched one of the largest banzai charges of the entire war, a desperate, all-out attack that broke through American lines and caused chaos before being finally halted, often in brutal hand-to-hand fighting near American rear area positions, including field hospitals. When the fighting finally ended, only a small handful of the original Japanese garrison, reportedly fewer than 30 men, survived to be taken prisoner. The rest fought to the death, or in a final horrifying act mirrored elsewhere in the Pacific War, took their own lives rather than surrender. The human cost was staggering relative to the size of the battle. Of a roughly 2,900 Japanese garrison, nearly the entire force was killed. American forces suffered around 3,800 casualties, including combat deaths, wounded, and a very high number of cold weather injury casualties, meaning that proportionally, Attu produced a casualty rate among American attacking forces that was, by some comparative measures cited by historians, higher than that experienced during the Normandy landings roughly a year later. It stands as one of the costliest island battles of the entire Pacific War relative to the number of troops actually involved. The battle also produced its own share of extraordinary acts of courage that, in a more heavily remembered campaign, might well have become the stuff of enduring wartime legend. Private Joe Martinez, a young soldier from Colorado, single-handedly assaulted a series of entrenched Japanese positions during the fighting for a key ridge, an action that ultimately cost him his life, but helped break the defensive line at a critical moment. An act of valor recognized after the war with the Medal of Honor, one of the very few awarded for actions during the entire Aleutian Campaign, and a rare instance of individual Attu heroism that has occasionally surfaced in broader American memory, even as the wider battle around it remains obscure. The terrain itself deserves particular attention as an active participant in the battle's brutality. Attu's landscape consists of steep volcanic ridgelines separated by boggy, waterlogged valleys, meaning American troops frequently had to fight uphill against entrenched defenders while simultaneously managing the physical toll of moving through terrain that alternated between ankle-deep mud and treacherous scree slopes, all while visibility could collapse to a few meters in the omnipresent fog. Commanders on the ground repeatedly reported that coordinating even relatively simple infantry maneuvers became extraordinarily difficult, with units sometimes losing contact with adjacent forces entirely for hours at a time. Conditions that help explain both the brutal casualty toll and the sheer length of a battle that, on paper, pitted a much larger American force against a considerably smaller Japanese garrison. Part 7. Kiska. The invasion that invaded nobody. If Attu represents one of the most brutal and least known battles of the Pacific War, Kiska represents one of its strangest and most anticlimactic episodes. Following the bloodbath at Attu, American and Canadian planners assembled a substantial combined invasion force for the assault on Kiska, the larger and more heavily fortified of the two occupied islands, anticipating, reasonably given what had just happened at Attu, that the Japanese garrison there, estimated at several thousand troops, would fight with similar or even greater ferocity given more time to prepare defensive positions. What planners didn't know was that Japan had already made the decision to abandon Kiska entirely. In a remarkable and highly skilled naval evacuation operation conducted under cover of the Aleutian's near-constant fog in late July 1943, Japanese ships successfully extracted the entire garrison of over 5,000 troops without American forces detecting the withdrawal, one of the more impressive, if largely unheralded, naval evacuation operations of the entire war, executed with a precision that stands in sharp, almost darkly comic contrast to the bloody battle that had just concluded on Attu. When the combined American and Canadian invasion force of over 34,000 troops landed on Kiska in August 1943, expecting another brutal fight, they found the island completely deserted. In the fog and confusion of the landing, American and Canadian units, unaware the Japanese were already gone, ended up firing on each other in a series of tragic friendly fire incidents, along with casualties from mines and booby traps the departing Japanese garrison had left behind. In the end, the Battle of Kiska produced roughly 300 American and Canadian casualties without a single shot being fired by an actual Japanese defender. A grimly ironic postscript to a campaign that had already claimed so many lives for such minimal strategic gain. Part 8. The People Who Fought in the Cold. The Aleutian Campaign is also notable for its genuinely international and multi-service character, often overlooked in accounts that focus purely on the U.S. versus Japan framing. Canadian troops played a substantial role in the Kiska operation, part of a broader pattern of close American-Canadian military cooperation in defense of the North American continent that also included the joint construction of the Alaska Highway during this same period, itself a massive engineering undertaking driven directly by the same invasion anxieties that shaped the Aleutian Campaign. American forces on Attu, meanwhile, included the 7th Infantry Division's mix of soldiers from across the country, many of whom had, as noted, trained for desert conditions in California before being thrown into what amounted to Arctic mountain warfare with grossly inadequate cold-weather equipment and clothing, a logistical and planning failure that contributed directly to the horrific rate of cold-weather casualties suffered during the battle. It's also worth noting the role of Alaska's indigenous population and Alaska Territory's broader defense infrastructure, including the Alaska Territorial Guard, a predominantly Alaska Native militia organized to help defend the territory's vast, thinly populated coastline against potential Japanese landings. A defense force whose story remains almost entirely absent from mainstream accounts of the Pacific War, despite its direct relevance to exactly the invasion anxiety that drove the entire Aleutian Campaign in the first place. Part 9. Why did this happen, and was it worth it? Here's the uncomfortable question that hangs over the entire campaign. Given how minimal the Aleutian's actual strategic value turned out to be, and given the horrific casualty rate at Attu in particular, was any of this actually necessary? The historical verdict on this question leans skeptical, though not without some genuine counterarguments. On one hand, allowing a foreign power to continue occupying sovereign American territory indefinitely carried real political and psychological costs that are difficult to fully dismiss, even if the islands themselves had little practical military value. A democratic government facing a public still anxious about invasion could not simply leave enemy troops sitting on the map indefinitely without consequence to morale and confidence in the war effort. There were also legitimate, if ultimately somewhat overstated, concerns about the Aleutian's potential use as a staging ground for future Japanese operations against Alaska or the broader Northwest had they been left in Japanese hands. On the other hand, critics, both at the time and among historians since, have pointed out that the actual strategic value Japan derived from holding Attu and Kiska was negligible, that the island's brutal weather made them poor staging grounds for any further offensive action in either direction, and that the resources poured into both the occupation and the eventual American reconquest, resources that included substantial naval, air, and ground forces that arguably could have been better used in the more strategically decisive Central and South Pacific campaigns unfolding simultaneously, represented a disproportionate investment relative to what was actually at stake. What's not in dispute is the human cost and the fact that the men who fought and died at Attu in particular experienced combat every bit as brutal and in some respects more physically punishing than almost anything else in the Pacific War, yet returned home, when they returned home at all, to a country that would go on to remember Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, and Okinawa in vivid detail, while the Aleutians faded almost entirely from popular memory within a generation. Part 9.5. The Hardware of a War Against the Weather. Before turning to the campaign's broader legacy, it's worth spending some time on just how much of this fight was really a battle against the environment itself rather than an enemy, because the Aleutians forced both sides to improvise in ways that make the campaign genuinely distinct from the rest of the Pacific War. American planning for Attu suffered from a critical and, in retrospect, almost inexplicable failure. The 7th Infantry Division, hastily reassigned from desert training exercises in California, was issued cold weather gear that proved badly inadequate for actual Arctic mountain conditions. Standard-issue leather boots soaked through in the constant wet snow and mud, contributing directly to trench foot and frostbite casualties that, by several accounts, exceeded the number of men wounded by actual Japanese fire. This equipment failure became something of a cautionary case study for the U.S. Army's subsequent approach to cold weather doctrine and gear development later in the war, informing improvements that would benefit soldiers fighting in colder European conditions during the following 2 winters. Naval and air operations were arguably even more shaped by the environment than the ground fighting. The 11th Air Force, tasked with the long, grinding bombing campaign against Japanese positions on Kiska and Attu throughout 1942 and early 1943, operated under conditions so poor that some units reported losing more aircraft to weather-related crashes than to enemy action, a statistic that held true for stretches of the campaign on both the American and Japanese sides. Pilots flying missions over the Aleutians often had to navigate through fog banks that could appear and vanish within minutes, making formation flying and accurate bombing extraordinarily difficult, and forcing the development of specialized navigation and weather forecasting techniques that some historians credit as an unheralded contribution to broader Allied meteorological and Arctic aviation knowledge later applied elsewhere in the war. On the Japanese side, the Japanese garrison forces on Kiska constructed an extensive network of tunnels, bunkers, and underground facilities to shelter from both American bombardment and the brutal Aleutian climate itself. Fortifications substantial enough that, had the Japanese garrison actually still been present when American and Canadian forces landed in August 1943, the resulting battle might well have rivaled or exceeded the ferocity of Attu, given how thoroughly the island had been prepared for defense. The scale of these abandoned Japanese fortifications, discovered intact by the landing force, offered a sobering glimpse of just how costly the Battle of Kiska could have been had Japan's evacuation not succeeded. Part 10. A front without a place in memory. Why has this campaign been so thoroughly forgotten, even relative to other lesser-known Pacific battles? Part of it simply geography and symbolism. The Aleutians never fit neatly into either the Pacific War's dominant island-hopping narrative toward Japan or the European theater's dominant narrative toward Germany, leaving it stranded in an awkward, hard-to-categorize corner of the broader war. Part of it is timing. Attu's brutal fighting occurred in the shadow of Midway's far more strategically decisive victory just a year earlier, and itself was quickly overshadowed by the far larger and more dramatic Pacific Island battles that followed at Tarawa, Saipan, and beyond. And part of it is simply that a campaign fought largely in featureless fog over islands most Americans couldn't locate on a map before or after the war lacks the visual and narrative drama that has shaped which battles get remembered, retold, and turned into the films and documentaries that anchor popular historical memory. But the Aleutian Islands Campaign remains quite simply the only land battle of the Second World War fought on incorporated United States soil, a fact that all alone should guarantee it a more prominent place in how Americans remember the war than it currently occupies. It's a story of a diversion that succeeded while its intended purpose failed catastrophically, of an evacuation so skillful that it left an entire invasion force firing at fog and each other, and of a battle at Attu so brutal that its survivors deserved far better than the near-total obscurity their sacrifice has been met with in the decades since. There is, in the end, something quietly fitting about the fact that this campaign is remembered so poorly, given how much of the fighting itself took place in conditions where soldiers on both sides frequently couldn't see more than a few meters in front of them. The Aleutians were, in almost every sense, a war fought in the fog, geographically, strategically, and now historically. But the men who died on that fog-bound volcanic rock, American, Japanese, Canadian, and the Unungax civilians caught in between, fought and suffered just as much as anyone remembered on the beaches of Normandy or the black sands of Iwo Jima. They simply did it somewhere the rest of the world stopped looking.